Hello everyone, welcome to yet another session on the paper Literary Criticism. In this session, we will be dealing with Module 3, 20th Century Literary Criticism. Now let's begin. Now the first critic in this period is T.S. Eliot. He lived from 1888 to 1965. T.S. Eliot was an American English poet, playwright, literary critic, and editor, a leader of the modernist movement in poetry in such works as The Wasteland and The Four Quartets, Wasteland was published in 1922 and Four Quartets was published in 1943. Now, you all know that T.S. Eliot is known as the towering figure of the 20th century, and in criticism, he speaks with authority and conviction. And when you look at his prose style, it is precise and memorable. And he is the one who was largely responsible for the revival of interest in the metaphysical poets. Now, you all know that apart from that, Eliot exercised a strong influence on Anglo American culture from the 1920s until late in the century. Now, the publication of Four Quartets led to his recognition as the greatest living English poet and man of letters. And besides all these, in 1948, he was awarded both the Order of Merit and the Nobel Prize for Literature. Please make note of this point. That is, in 1948, he was awarded both the Order of Merit and the Nobel Prize for Literature. Now, Eliot's principal critical works include, that is, he has written many poetry, and apart from that, his critical works include Tradition and Individual Talent, which was published in 1919, Hamlet and His Problems, which was published in 1920, The Metaphysical Poets, which was published in 1921, The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, which was published in 1933, Poetry and Drama in 1951, and On Poetry and Poets in 1957. These are some of his important critical works which he contributed to the literature. Now let's talk about Tradition and Individual Talent, which is prescribed in your syllabus. Now you know that Tradition and the Individual Talent was first published in 1919 in Times Literary Supplement. Okay, this work was first published in Times Literary Supplement, which is an unofficial manifesto of Eliot's critical creed. And this essay is written in three parts. The first part is Conception of Tradition, and in the second part, he discusses impersonality of poetry, and in the third part, he concludes the discussion. Now, this is how he has framed this essay. Now, let's begin. Eliot begins the essay by pointing out the word tradition, and which is generally regarded as a word of censure. Now, when the English praise a poet, they praise him for those aspects of his work that are individual and original. Now, if they examine the matter critically with an unprejudiced mind, they will realize that the best and the most individual part of a poet's work is that which shows the maximum influence of the writers of the past. Now, whereas if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best but the most individual part of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, asserts their immortality most vigorously. Now, in this essay, he begins by pointing out the importance of the word tradition, which was generally regarded as a word of censure. Okay, and this he also says that usually an English praise a poet for certain qualities of his work, mainly when a work is of that are of an individual and original, he is praised for his work. Now, in the first part, what you find is that he has given undue stress on individuality, and that shows that the English have an uncritical turn of mind. Okay, and He also says that in the best and most individual part of the modern poets, the dead poet asserts their immortality. So, tradition implies recognition of the continuity of literature, a critical judgment as to which of the writers of the past continue to be significant in the present, and knowledge of these significant writers obtained through painstaking effort. So, this is the meaning of tradition. Now, tradition means one is recognition of the continuity of literature, and second important point is a critical judgment. Okay, you have to judge critically as to which of the writers of the past continue to be significant in the present. Okay, which of the writers of the past continue to be important in the present. And the third point is knowledge of these significant writers obtained through painstaking effort. So this is what he means by tradition. Okay, and he also talks about the dynamic concept of tradition. Now he says that just as the past directs and guides the present, so the present also alters and modifies the past. That's what he mentioned in the second point. If they examine the matter critically with an unprejudiced mind, they will realize that the best and the most individual part of the poet's work is that which shows the maximum influence of the writers of the past, and vice versa. And to know the tradition, the poet must judge critically what are the main trends and what are not. So, in order to know the tradition, the poet must judge critically what are the main trends that are existing and what are not existing. Okay, so with that, we come to the end of tradition. Now, what is historical sense? And here again, the poet says that tradition does not mean blind adherence to the ways of the previous generation or generations. So here, like I said just now, tradition in the sense of passive repetition is to be discouraged. So you should not use the word tradition or the sense of tradition in a passive way. That should not be entertained. For Eliot, tradition in the true sense of the term cannot be inherited. It can only be obtained by hard labor. So that's what I was talking about just now. That is, tradition cannot be obtained, which means it cannot be inherited. Rather, it is obtained through hard work. Tradition can be obtained only by those who have the historical sense. So, if you have a historical sense, you can obtain tradition. Now, the historical sense involves a perception. Now, what is that perception? Not only of the pastness of the past, but also of its presence. So, historical sense means it is not the idea about the pastness of the past, but also of its presence, its importance in the present. One who has the historical sense feels that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer down to his day, including the literature of his own country, forms one continuous literary tradition. Now, this is what I was talking about. Continuity, recognition of the continuity of literature. That is, if a person is having a historical sense, he will know the importance of the past and also the importance of the past in the present. And the one who has the historical sense only recognize the continuity of literature till date. Okay, that is, he is the person, or the person with historical sense will consider the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer down to his day, including the literature of his own country, forms one continuous literary tradition. Now, what is the function of tradition? Now, like we discussed right now, the work of a poet in the present is to be compared and contrasted with works of the past and judged by the standards of the past. So, you have to judge a work of of a poet in the present with the standards of the poet in the past. And an author in the present is certainly not to be judged by the principles and standards of the past, but the comparison is to be made for knowing the facts, all the facts about the new work of art. So you should not compare him, the present poet with the past, uh, based on the principles and standards of the past, but instead how the new work of art is important, and what are the facts that make the new work of art important. In that sense, the comparison is to be made. And the comparison is made for analysis and for forming a better understanding of the new one. Okay, and moreover, this comparison is reciprocal. So past work, present work is compared with the past. Similarly, past work can also be compared with the present. So vice versa, it could be reciprocal as well. Now, the past helps us to understand the present, and the present throws light on the past. So, it is what to say, depending on each other. That is, you cannot live in the present without the past, and you cannot know about the past without giving any importance to the present. So, it is reciprocal and dependent on each other. Now, what is the sense of tradition and what is its real meaning? Now, the sense of tradition does not mean that the poet should try to know the past as a whole, take it to be a lump or mass without any discrimination. Now, the sense of tradition means you should know the past without any discrimination. Now, the past must be examined critically and only the significance in it should be acquired. Now, you can examine the past critically, and you should know only the why it is so important, or the importance of this past should be critically examined and understood. Now, the sense of tradition does not also mean that the poet should know only a few poets whom he admires. That is what we were talking about, without any discrimination, without any prejudice, without any biased notion. We should have the sense of tradition. That is, you should not favor or you should not compare by looking into a few poets whom you admire. Instead, you should look into the past without any discrimination. This is a sign of immaturity and inexperience. So if you are comparing with a few poets whom you admire, then it is a sign of immaturity and inexperience. Okay, neither should a poet be content merely to know some particular age or period which he likes. So you should not observe such things in a subjective way. Rather, you should observe such things in an objective way. This may be delightful, but it will not constitute a sense of tradition. So when you are giving your personal interest in it, then it won't constitute a sense of tradition. Rather, if you look it in an objective way, in an unbiased way, then it is more delightful, and it will constitute a sense of tradition. Now, T.S. Eliot is conscious of the criticism that will be made of his theory of tradition. His view of tradition requires, it will be said, a ridiculous amount of erudition. So he says that his view of tradition requires thought, clarity, and it should be considered with great intelligence. Now, in the second part of the essay, he was talking about impersonality of poetry, or rather extinction of personality. Now, what does he say with impersonality of poetry? Now, by impersonality of poetry, he says that personality of the poet is not important. The important thing is his sense of tradition. Now, the artist must continually surrender himself to something more valuable than himself, which means his personality is not important. And what is the thing which he should give importance? Literary tradition or sense of tradition. Now, the poet must allow his poetic sensibility to be shaped and modified by the past. He must continue to acquire a sense of tradition through his career. His emotions and passions must be depersonalized. It should not be personalized. He must be an impersonal and objective as a scientist. So, he should not have any personalized version of emotion or passion. Rather, he must be impersonal and objective, just like a scientist. Now, the personality of the artist is not important. The important thing is his sense of tradition. Now, the poet's personality is merely a medium, having the same significance as a catalytic agent or a receptacle in which chemical reaction takes place. So his personality is just a medium. Other than that, or it just gives a catalytic function as a catalytic agent, uh, nothing more than that. So Eliot holds that honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is direct not upon the poet but the poetry. So when you are criticizing a poetry, the criticism or sensitive appreciation should not be directed upon the poet, rather it should be on the poetry written by him. Now here mm he also talks about the poetic process, the analogy of the catalyst. Now, in the second part of the essay, Eliot develops further his theory of the impersonality of poetry. He compares the mind of the poet to a catalyst and the process of poetic creation to the process of a chemical reaction. So, here he compares the mind of a poet to a catalyst which promotes a chemical reaction, and the process of poetic creation is like the process of a chemical reaction with the help of a catalyst. Now, new combinations of emotions and experiences must take place, but it does not undergo any change during the process of poetic combination. So, new combination of emotion and experience must take place while you are in the process of poetic creation, but nothing change during the process of poetic combination. Now, the mind of the poet is constantly forming emotions and experiences into new wholes, but the new combination does not contain even a trace of the poet's mind. And the man suffers, that is, he has experiences, but it is his mind which transforms his experiences into something new or different. So, what you experience or what you has undergone, that is transformed through the mind of a person, and it is transformed into something new and different. Now, the personality of the poet does not find expression in poetry. It acts as a catalytic agent because the experience he had undergone helps as an agent in the process of poetic composition when his mind works. All right. Now, this is what he says. Now, he also talks about the emotions and feelings a person has. Now, the experiences which enters the poetic process, says Eliot, may be of two kinds. They are emotions and feelings. Now, it's like a scientific reaction. Poet's mind works. That the poetic creation is just like a chemical reaction, and his experiences also act as a catalyst, and it is in that sense his personality becomes important. Other than that, there is no importance for his personality. And the experiences which enter the poetic process may be of two kinds. One may be emotion and the other will be feeling. Poetry may be composed out of emotion only, or out of feelings only, or out of both. So these two are the main agents of poetic process. Now, T.S. Eliot here distinguishes between emotions and feeling, but he does not state what this difference is. Nowhere else in his writing also says A.G. George, and it is this distinction maintained. Neither does he adequately distinguish between the meaning of the two words. So there are distinction between these two, but he does not clearly state what is the distinction between the two. Now, the distinction should be ignored more so as it has no bearing on his impersonal theory of poetry. So this distinction or this difference is ignored mainly because it has no bearing on the impersonal theory of his poetry. So we should understand that his poetry, that is in the second part, he was talking about impersonality of poetry, which means personality of the poet is not important, and the important thing is his sense of tradition. And honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is not directed upon the poet but upon the poetry. And he also compares the mind of a poet to a catalyst and the process of the poetic creation to a chemical reaction. He also compares poet's mind to a receptacle or a jar in which numberless feelings and emotions are stored. Thus, poetry is organization rather than inspiration. And the greatness of the poem lies in the intensity of the process of poetic composition. And poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from it. So this is what he talks about in the second part, which means poetry is an organization rather than inspiration. And he talks about the intensity of the poetic process, and he says that the greatness of a poem does not depend upon the greatness or even the intensity of the emotion, which are the components of the poem, but upon the intensity of the process of poetic composition. Just as a chemical reaction takes place under pressure, so also intensity is needed for the fusion of emotion. So the more intense the poetic process, the greater the poem. You might have heard that some persons with extreme emotions or deep emotions, or when they are in an intense situation or extreme situation, they tend to write poetry. Even you might have come across Shakespeare's life. He wrote his masterpiece when he was facing tragedy in his life, especially in the third period of his literary career, and he produced masterpiece that is tragedy, three tragic works during those period, including Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, and Macbeth. I mean, four tragedies. He wrote four tragedies during those crucial times when he was in turmoil. Okay, so the more intense the poetic process, the greater the poem. And there is always a difference between the artistic emotion and the personal emotion of the poet. For example, the famous Ode to Nightingale of Keats contain a number of emotions that have nothing to do with the nightingale. So that is an example. So all this comes from the artistic emotion he had. Okay, Eliot thus rejects romantic subjectivism, and instead he gives importance to impersonality of poetry. Now, artistic emotion, the value of concentration. Now he talks about the artistic emotion and the value of concentration. The emotion of poetry is different from the personal emotions of the poet. His emotions may be simple or crude, but the emotion of his poetry may be complex and refined. So this is what he says about the emotion. And it is the mistaken notion that the poet must express new emotion that results in many eccentricities in poetry. So that is a false notion. It is not necessary that he should express new emotion which may result in eccentricities in poetry. His emotion could be simple or crude, but every difference is made in the emotion of his poetry, and that makes his poetry complex and refined. He may express only ordinary emotions, but he must impart to them a new significance and a new meaning. So even in some writers express ordinary things in their life, but they add new meaning and new layer to it, and that makes that poetry special. Now, Eliot rejects Wordsworth's theory of poetry having its origin in emotions recollected in tranquility, and he points out that in the process of poetic composition, there is neither emotion, nor recollection, nor tranquility. And Eliot is against Wordsworth's theory of poetry. And in the process, there is only concentration of many experiences, and a new thing results from this concentration. So, T.S. Eliot gives importance to the concentration of many experiences, and he says that new things result from or is the result of that concentration. And he also rejects Wordsworth's theory of poetry that poetry's origin in emotions recollected in tranquility, and he says that there is neither emotion nor recollection of tranquility. Everything depends on the concentration of the experiences, and new things are the result of that experience or concentration. Now, next important term. So this is how he concludes his discussion. He talks about objective correlative. Now, the theory of the objective correlative is one of the most important critical concepts of T.S. Eliot. The term objective correlative was first used by American painter Washington Allston in the 19th century, and later it was revived by T.S. Eliot. Okay. Now, in this concept, of objective correlative, Eliot's doctrine of poetic impersonality finds its most classic formulation. He formulated his doctrine of the objective correlative in his essay on Hamlet and his problem. This is very important point. So he talks about objective correlative in his essay on Hamlet and his problems, which was published in 1919. And according to Eliot, the poet cannot communicate his emotions directly to the readers. He has to find some object suggestive of it, and only then he can evoke the same emotion in his readers. So, according to Eliot, what he says is that a poet cannot express or communicate his emotion directly to the reader. Instead, he has to use some object which can communicate that idea, and only then he can evoke that same emotion in his readers. So, the objective correlative means it is a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion, such that when the external facts which must terminate in sensory experience are given, the emotion is immediately evoked. For example, I'll just repeat it. A set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula for the poet's emotion, so that when the external facts are given, the emotion is at once evoked. For example, Hamlet. Hamlet is an artistic failure. This is how we consider it. And for Clement Brooks, objective correlative means organic metaphor. Now here, Eliot cites an example to prove his doctrine from Shakespeare's Macbeth, especially a sleepwalking scene, etc. Okay, through that he says he is trying to relate that situation, Lady Macbeth's madness, through that sleepwalking scene, etc. Now, next important term is dissociation of sensibility. Now, the idea of dissociation of sensibility is first used in his essay, The Metaphysical Poets, which was published in 1921. So you should understand that objective correlative is in his work, Hamlet and his problems, and impersonality of poetry is in the essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, and dissociation of sensibility is used in his essay, Metaphysical Poets. Now, here it is an attempt to find some kind of historical explanation for the dissolution of the tradition of unified sensibility, which found its perfection in the writings of Dante and Shakespeare. Now, the unified sensibility was a sensibility that was the product of a true synthesis of individual with the traditional, of feeling with thought, and of the temporal with the eternal. So, this is what unified sensibility, that is fusion of thought and feeling. Okay, and a recreation of thoughts into feeling, a direct sensuous apprehension of thought, etc. Now, according to Eliot, the traditions of unified sensibility were suddenly disturbed in the 17th century as a result of a split in the creative personality of the artist, for which he formulated his famous theory, the dissociation of sensibility. Now, this is what he says. He says that both dissociation of sensibility and unification of sensibility, both these are the other terms used by T.S. Eliot. He used it in metaphysical poetry, poet, that essay, and fusion, which means fusion of thoughts and feeling in a simple way. Then a recreation of thought into feeling, a direct sensuous apprehension of thought. Now, he says bad poetry results when there is dissociation of sensibility. That is, poet is unable to feel his thoughts. And Eliot finds such unification of sensibility uh, in the metaphysical poets and regrets that in the late 17th century, a dissociation of sensibility set in because of the result in the split in the creative personality of the artist. And these were the influences of Milton and Dryden, and it has been harmful. Influence of Milton and Dryden has been harmful. Now, unification of sensibility means harmonious working of the creative and critical faculties of a poet. But dissociation of sensibility means fusion of thought and feeling. And bad poetry result when there is dissociation of sensibility. That is, poet is unable to feel his thoughts. That's how uh, he talks about dissociation of sensibility. Now, dissociation of sensibility, like we said, in the 17th century, a dissociation of sensibility set in from which we have never recovered, and this dissociation, as is natural, was aggravated by the influence of the two most powerful poets of the century, Milton and Dryden. And by sensibility, Eliot does not merely mean feeling or the capacity to receive sense impression. He means much more than that. Now, by sensibility, he means a synthetic faculty, a faculty which can amalgamate and unite thought and feeling, which can fuse into a single whole the varied and dissimilar, often opposite and contradictory experience, the sensuous and the intellectual. So, that amalgamation, the faculty of amalgamation of thought and feeling, is known as sensibility. Okay, now with that we come to the end of T.S. Eliot, and next important writer is I.A. Richards, who lived from 1893 to 1979. Now, as you all know, I.A. Richards is one of the most influential figures of the 20th century literary criticism, who provided a scientific basis for critical exercise. Okay, and he was born in Cheshire. He studied philosophy at Cambridge University and later became a teaching faculty in Magdalen College, Cambridge, and in China, and finally in Harvard. Okay, I'm sure this is very clear to you. And his seminal work or important works include Principles of Literary Criticism, Practical Criticism, Interpretation in Teaching, Coleridge on Imagination, The Foundation of Aesthetics with C.K. Ogden and James Wood, and The Meaning of Meaning with Ogden. So these are some of his important works. Then I.A. Richards is recognized as the pioneer of new criticism, and he is also best known for advancing the close reading of literature and for articulating the theoretical principles upon which these skills lead to practical criticism. Now, practical criticism means a method of increasing readers' analytical power. So this is what his contribution. So he is considered as the pioneer of new criticism. He is best known for advancing the close reading of literature, and he also is known for the theoretical principle where the skills lead to practical criticism, and it is a method of increasing readers' analytical power. Now he talks about the four kinds of meaning, and that is known as the functions of language. Now in practical criticism, he talks about the function of language. Basically, he points out four types of functions or meaning that the language has to perform. Now here he talks about four types of functions. Now one is sense, second one is feeling, third one is tone, and fourth one is intention. Now, sense means what speaker or author speaks is a sense, and the thing that the writer conveys is also sense. So, sense means the matter, or the what the speaker or author speaks is sense. The thing that the writer conveys is sense. So, the subject is known as sense. Now, feeling is the writer's emotional attitude towards the subject. Now, it means the writer's attachment or detachment to the subject is feeling. It is an expression, especially in a lyric poem, emotion plays a vital role. So feeling means the emotional attitude towards subject. Now tone. Tone denotes the attitude of the speaker towards his listener. So the tone denotes the attitude of the speaker towards his listener. There is a kind of relation between speaker and listener. So the tone could be sad, it could be happy, it could be emotional. So this tone is determined by the kind of relation between speaker and listener. And it is an attitude of the speaker towards his listener. Now, intention. Feeling is only a state of the mind. It does not imply an object, but intention has an object. The intention is the writer's aim, which may be conscious or unconscious. So intention means it is the aim of the writer. It could be conscious or unconscious, and it carries an object. Okay, but feeling does not have an object. It does not imply an object. It is just a state of mind. But intention means there is a purpose, there is an intention, and that is what the aim or the purpose of the writing is there. It could be conscious or unconscious. So, in practical criticism, Richards exemplifies how one or the other of the above mentioned functions may predominate the meaning concerning the writer and the context. So, there are four kinds of meaning, and that determines the function of the language. What are they? Sense, feeling, tone, and intention. Now, he again talks about scientific and emotive use of language. Now, he has written an essay, Two Uses of Language in Practical Criticism, and this essay discusses the two different uses of language. One is scientific and the other one is emotive. Now, we may use a statement true or false in the scientific use of language, but it may also be used to create emotions and attitudes. This is emotive use of language. So, in scientific use of language, there is a statement. It could either be true or false. Okay, but when you are using statement to create emotion or attitude, it is called emotive use of language. Now, the referential or scientific language relies on the literal sense of the word, which is fixed and delimited. Now, there is no room for imagination in this language, whereas in emotive language, words evoke emotions or attitudes. So, it's very clear from the term itself. Scientific means it relies on the literal sense of the word, and it is fixed and delimited, no room for imagination. But in emotive language, words evoke emotions or attitude. There is room for imagination. Okay, and it is not limited and it is not fixed. Now, in the scientific use of language, the reference should be correct and the relation of the reference should be logical. Now, when you're using language in a scientific way, reference should be correct because science depends on truth and the relation of references should be logical. And in the emotive use of language, any truth or logical arrangement is not necessary. It may work as an obstacle. So, truth or logical arrangement is not necessary in emotive use of language. Now, I. Richards cites the example of Robinson Crusoe to elucidate that the truth or logic in the emotive language is nothing other than acceptability or probability. So, acceptability or probability is given importance. So, truth or logic is not given much importance in emotive language. Next writer is F.R. Levis. He lived from 1895 to 1978. And F.R. Levis or Frank Raymond Levis is often described as one of the most influential figures in the history of 20th century literary criticism, particularly in British context. And it's said that he studied at Cambridge University and started his career as a teacher at the same time university, and later he taught in Downing College for 30 years. Now he talks about four stages in the critical hour of Lewis. In the first stage, he was more concerned with poetry, and new bearings in poetry is the byproduct of the first stage, which was published in 1932. And in the second stage, he mainly focused on fiction. And in the third stage, his main concern was on social and educational issues. And in the final stage, he published books like The Living Principle, English as a Discipline of Thought, and Thought, Words and Creativity, Art and Thought in Lawrence, which was published in 1976, which are more philosophical in content. So these are the four stages in the critical experiences of Lewis. There are four stages. So in the first stage, he was concerned with poetry. In the second stage, focused on fiction. In the third stage, his main concern were on social and educational issues. And in the final stage, he published books, and they were more philosophical in content. Now, he talks about the concept of literature and criticism. Now, Lewis always lays stress on the moral value of a work of literature, and he believes that literature is a criticism of life and it has a great historical and moral responsibility to society. So, F.R. Lewis stressed on the moral value of a work of literature, and he believed that literature is a criticism of life and has a great historical and moral responsibility to society. He also put forward the idea of enactment, which is one of the key concepts of his criticism. Enactment. So, the idea of enactment was put forward by F.R. Lewis. Now, according to this, a work of literature acts or demonstrates a moral sentiment rather than merely expressing it through words. So, according to this concept of enactment or idea of enactment, a work of literature acts or demonstrates a moral sentiment rather than merely expressing it through words. He was against the Victorian practice of separating thought and feeling. His concept of literature was largely determined by his appreciation of the culture and literature of the 17th and 18th century. So he says that he was against Victorian practice of separating thought and feeling. Instead, he gave importance for his appreciation of culture and literature of the 17th and 18th century. And in his work, The Great Tradition, which was published in 1948, he reassessed English fiction, proclaiming Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, and Joseph Conrad as the greatest novelists of the past and D.H. Lawrence as their only successor. Okay, and this was discussed in his work D.H. Lawrence, Novelist, 1955. Okay, so in his work, The Great Tradition, he reassessed English fiction and he proclaimed that Jane Austen, George Eliot, Henry James, and Joseph Conrad are as the great novelists of the past and D.H. Lawrence as their only successor. So, with that, we come to the end of F.R. Lewis, and now we are talking about yet another concept, that is formalism. Formalism refers to a style of inquiry that focuses almost exclusively on features of the literary text itself to the exclusion of biographical, historical, or intellectual context. So, in formalism, uh, uh, biographical, historical, or intellectual contexts are excluded. They are not considered. Instead, formalism uh, gives importance to the features of literary text itself. It gives importance to the text itself. Now, the name formalism derives from one of the central tenets of formalist thought. Now, by focusing on literary form and excluding unnecessary context, formalists believe that it would be possible to trace the evolution and development of literary forms and thus literature itself. So, they focused on literary form and they excluded unnecessary context. Okay, and the formalist literary theory views literature primarily as a specialized use of language. It proposes a fundamental opposition between the literary use of language and the ordinary practical use of language. So they proposes a fundamental opposition between the literary use of language and ordinary language, and they also view that literature as a specialized use of language. And the distinctive feature of literary language are called literariness. The literariness of a work consists in the maximum of foregrounding of the utterance. Now, to the foreground is to bring something into prominence, to make it dominant in perception. Now, literariness of a work consists in the maximum of foregrounding of the utterance. That is, um, the utterance or the content is given more prominence. In the perception of the poetry or the work is given more importance. Okay, the maximum of foregrounding of the utterance. As a literary movement, formalism has two distinctive schools in history. One is Russian formalism. It was the first movement, and its Anglo-American version, better known as New Criticism. So, formalism has got two distinctive schools in history. One is Russian formalism, and then its Anglo-American version, which is known as New Criticism. Now, Russian formalism refers primarily to the work of the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, founded in 1916 in St. Petersburg, then Petrograd, by Boris Eichenbaum, Victor Shklovsky, and Yuri Dinionov, and secondarily to the Moscow Linguistic Circle, founded in 1914 by Roman Jakobson. This is very important point to be noted. So Russian formalism refers primarily to the works of the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, founded in 1916 in St. Petersburg by Boris Eichenbaum, Victor Shklovsky, and Yuri Tinyanov, and secondarily to the Moscow Linguistic Circle, founded in 1914 by Roman Jakobson. Eichenbaum's 1926 essay, The Theory of the Formal Method, provides an economical overview of the approach the formalists advocated, which include the following basic ideas. Now, what is the basic idea discussed in the Theory of the Formal Method by Eichenbaum? First one, the aim is to produce a science of literature that would be both independent and factual. And second one, since literature is made of language, linguistics will be a foundational element of the science of literature. So science of literature, which is independent and factual, is given importance. Then linguistics is given importance, and then literature is autonomous from external conditions, in the sense that literary language is distinct from ordinary use of language, not least because it is not entirely communicative. So literature should be autonomous. Then literature has its history, a history of innovative informal structures, and is not determined by external material history. So literature has its history, a history of innovation, informal structure, and it is not determined by any external or material history. So these are the main ideas included in Eichenbaum's 1926 essay, The Theory of the Formal Method. Now, next important concept is defamiliarization. The Russian formalist concept of defamiliarization, proposed by Victor Shklovsky in his art as technique, refers to the literary device whereby language is used in such a way that ordinary and familiar objects are made to look different. Now, defamiliarization, the term itself says that making unfamiliar the familiar things, or making the ordinary and familiar object look unfamiliar. That is the meaning of defamiliarization. So it is a technique used by Victor Shklovsky in his art as technique, whereby language is used in such a way that ordinary and familiar objects are made to look different. Now, Victor Shklovsky uses the term estrangement or defamiliarization to designate this function of literature. To defamiliarize means to disrupt the modes of ordinary linguistic discourse. And he claims that this enhances the aesthetic experience of the reader. Now, this adds beauty to the aesthetic experience of the reader. And the purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make object unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. The object is not important. So here what he is trying to say is that the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, and that is how the process of perception is done, and it must be prolonged. And art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object, and here the object is not important. Next important concept is fabula, that is story, and Josette, that is plot. Now, the plot or story distinction, the second aspect of literary evolution according to Shklovsky, and it is the distinction between the sequence of events the text relates, that is story. The sequence of events the text relates is story, that is fabula, from the sequence into which those events are presented in the work. Okay, the events that are present in the work are called plot, that is Josette. By emphasizing how the plot of any fiction naturally diverge from the chronological sequence of its story. Now, Shlovsky was able to emphasize the importance of paying an extraordinary amount of attention to the plot, that is, the form of a text, to understand its meaning. So, in formalism, the form of the text is given more importance. Okay, and both of these concepts are an attempt to describe the significance of the form of a literary work to define its literariness. So, this is how formalism works. Next is motivation. Motivation is a concept propounded by formalist Boris Tomaszewski, which is about motives. A motive is the smallest unit of a plot. Uh, Tomaszewski divides motive into free and bound motives. Bound motives are those units of the plot which are essential to the story. That is, bound means it is very important, it is essential. They cannot be removed from the plot without radically changing the narrative structure. On the other hand, free motives are not essential elements of the plot but enhance its beauty if added. Now, there are various motives like sea, journey, death, etc. Okay. Now, next important thing is new criticism. New criticism was the dominant trend in English and American literary criticism of the mid 20th century, from the 1920s to the mid to the late 1960s. Now, the movement has got its name from the title of John Crow Ransom's book, The New Criticism, which was published in 1941. Now, this point is very important. Now, it was a practice that was expressed most cogently in three important books. One is Principles of Literary Criticism, published in 1924, Practical Criticism, which was published in 1929 by the English critic I. Richards, and Understanding Poetry, which was published in 1938 by the Americans Kenneth Brooks and Robert Van Warren. They advocated close reading and attention to text themselves and their rejection of criticism based on extra textual sources, especially biography. So, criticism based on biography were given no importance, and they advocated close reading and attention or importance to the text themselves. Now, what is new criticism? The new criticism were eventually usurped by the development of post-structuralism, deconstruction, post-colonialism, and cultural studies, and more politically oriented schools of literary theory. Now, new criticism became the epitome of a backward model of conducting literary research that paid no attention to anything outside the small world of a closed text. Okay, so they did not give any importance to anything outside the text. So in 1954, William K. Wimsett and Munro Beardsley published an essay entitled The Intentional Fallacy that would become a seminal text in the development of new criticism. So another important text of new criticism is The Intentional Fallacy, and it was written by William K. Wimsett and Munro Beardsley. Now, the essay argued strongly against any discussion of an author's intention or intended meaning. So, they were against the discussion of an author's intention or intended meaning. Each of the new critics came up with new concepts and their unique methods to analyze literary text. So, all critics had their own new concepts and their unique methods to analyze literary text. Now, William Empson, here there is EMPSON. William Empson's ambiguity came up with a concept of ambiguity. Kenneth Brooks came up with paradox. Robert Van Warren came up with irony, and so on. All of these concepts are connected in their common effort to trace the meaning of a text, but their methods are unique. Now, what is close reading or explication? Now, close reading of the text is one of the important tools for finding the underlying meaning of a text for new critics. So, close reading is very important, and it is one of the important tools for finding the underlying meaning of a text for new critics. Now, it is a close analysis of the linguistic elements of the text, including words and syntax. Now, the idea of close reading was first proposed by I.A. Richards in his Methods of Practical Criticism. So, I think it's very clear. So, close reading was first proposed by I.A. Richards. It is an important tool for finding the underlying meaning of a text, especially it is used by new critics. Now, explication is a literary technique used for close analysis of a text. Now, this originates from the French phrase explication de text, meaning explanation of a text. Okay, so explication originates from the French phrase explication de text, meaning explanation of a text. And it is a formal and detailed assessment of all aspects of a text, like poetic devices, style, and content, and a close examination of the figure of speech, tone, setting, connotation, ambiguities, point of view, themes, contrasts, paradoxes that are present in the text. So this is a detailed and formal assessment of all aspects of a text. Now, with that, we come to the end of close reading or explication, which is first proposed by I.A. Richards, and it's part of new criticism. Next one is ambiguity. Now, ambiguity is a literary term put forward by William Empson in his work Seven Types of Ambiguity, which is published in 1930. It's very important, and this book was influential as one of the foundations of the new criticism. And in Seven Types of Ambiguity, Empson sought to enrich the reader's understanding of a poem. So through that, he is trying to enrich the reader's understanding of poetry. He suggested that words or reference in poems are often ambiguous and, if presented coherently, carry multiple meanings that can enrich the reader's appreciation of the work. So he says that words or references in poems are often ambiguous. So if you are presenting it in an apt way, in a logical way, it will carry multiple meaning, and that will enrich the reader's appreciation of the work. And he also argued that the complexities of cognitive and tonal meanings in poetry form the basis of the reader's emotional response. So the complexities of his understanding and the tonal meaning in poetry form the basis of the reader's emotional response. He argues that the complexities of cognitive and tonal meanings in poetry form the basis of the reader's emotional response when a detail is effective in several ways simultaneously, and two, when two or more alternative meanings are resolved into one, and three, when two apparently unconnected meanings are given simultaneously. So these are the situations when ambiguity is created. Now, number one, when a detail is effective in several ways simultaneously. So some details can be effected in several ways at the same time. So that creates ambiguity. And if there are two or more alternative meaning and it is resolved into one, then also ambiguity is there. And when two apparently unconnected meanings are given simultaneously, that is at the same time, then also this ambiguity is there. And when alternative meanings combine to make clear a complicated state of mind in the author. Okay, so a kind of confusion when a writer discovers his idea while writing. In other words, he has not preconceived idea but comes upon it during the act of creation. So some ideas remain confused, whether we doubt whether the author intended the same thing or not. So you know what is ambiguity? Ambiguity means confusion or lack of clarity. Now the sixth one is where something appears to contain a contradiction and the reader has to find the interpretation. That is when something is open to the reader or left open to the reader, this kind of ambiguity is there. That is when something appears to contain a contradiction and the reader has to find the interpretation. And last one, a complete contradiction that shows that the author was unclear as to what he was saying. So if we don't get the clarity, like what the author was trying to say, etc., that also will create ambiguity. So these are the 7 ways of ambiguities discussed in William Empson's work. Next is paradox. A paradox is a self-contradictory statement. The term is derived from the Greek word paradon, which means contrary to expectations, existing belief, or perceived opinion. So, self-contradictory statement, just opposite thing. So that is known as paradox. It is derived from the Greek word paradoxon, means contrary to expectation. Now, paradox became established as a widely used critical term with the publication of Kenneth Brooks' The Well-Wrought Urn. Now, this is an important work, The Well-Wrought Urn, which was published in 1947. Brooks argued that language of poetry is the language of paradox. So, language of poetry means it is the language of paradox. It is self-contradictory. And Brooks believed that the main way in which the writer managed to bring opposites together and so create a unified whole was through paradox. Now, the paradox in a work always suggests an attempt to confront and come to terms with the contradictions of experience. So, paradox always suggest confrontation, and it also come to terms with the contradictions of experience. So that is what paradox is all about. Next is irony. Irony is a way of writing in which what is meant is contrary to what the word appears to say. So just opposites. So every terms, that is ambiguity, paradox, irony, all are related in one way or the other. Okay. So irony is a way of writing in which what is meant is contrary to what the word appears to say or appears to be. Now, M.H. Abrams defined irony as, in the most of the modern critical use of the term irony, there remains the root sense of dissembling or hiding what is actually the case to achieve special rhetorical or artistic. That is, the real meaning will not be conveyed. Instead, we feel the opposite, or it is expressed in the opposite way. It is just to give a special rhetorical or artistic effect. Now, Brooks defined irony as the obvious wrapping of the statement by the context. Irony is created because of the pressure of the context. So, according to Brooks, irony is created because of the pressure of the context. For instance, this is the fine state of affair. Now, in this statement means it is quite the opposite of what it purports to say literally. Now, this is sarcasm, the most obvious kind of it. This is the fine state of affairs. Here, the writer means just the opposite. This is not the right state of affair, or it is not the good state of affair. He means that, but when you read it, you feel just the opposite. That is, you feel that it is good, but actually he means the opposite. Now, next is tension. Tension in poetry by poet John Orley Allen Tate, in which he suggests the word tension could be used to describe a way of looking at the poem as a whole to derive both its meaning and its effect. So Allen Tate used this word for the first time, and he suggests the word tension could be used to describe a way of looking at the poem as a whole to derive both its meaning and its effect. Now, Tate, a leading member of the New Criticism school, specifically used the word tension as something he called a special metaphor that could be used by critics to evaluate poetry. Now, he used this word as a special metaphor, and this is used by critics to evaluate poetry. Now, he came up with it as a word derived from looping the prefixes of the logical term extension. So, tension is created, or it is formed from the word extension and intention. He avoided the prefix ex and in, and he only took tension. So he derived this word from looping the prefixes of the logical terms extension and intention. So tension is a word formed from the extension and intention. He suggested that a poem can possess a single critical aesthetic attribute, tension, that creates a more pleasing and more important experience for the reader. So he uses the word tension and he says that it creates a more pleasing and more important experience for the reader, and he suggested that a poem can possess a single critical aesthetic attribute. Next one is intentional fallacy. It is a term introduced by W.K. Wimsett Jr. and Monroe C. Beardsley in The Verbal Icon, which was published in 1954. And here he describes the problem inherent in trying to judge a work of art by assuming the intent or purpose of the artist who created it. So he is trying to describe the problem inherent in trying to judge a work of art by assuming the intent or purpose of the artist who created it. Now, the few critics consider this approach of judging a work is a fallacy. So, this way of judging a work is called fallacy, and according to them, a text is not an exclusive property of the author. So, they say that it is not an exclusive property of the author. This kind of approach of judging a work is called fallacy, and he says it belongs to the public, so the attempt of finding out the intention of the author is completely unwarranted. So when you write a work for the public, it is for the public, it belongs to the public, and so the attempt of finding the intention of the author is completely unwarranted or unnecessary. So that is the way of judging a work by assuming the intent or purpose of the artist or the author who created it is a fallacy, and that's called intentional fallacy. Now, next one is archetypal criticism. The term archetype denotes recurrent narrative design, patterns of action, character types, themes, and images that are identifiable in a wide variety of works of literature, as well as myths, dreams, or even social rituals. So, the term archetype, it means recurrent narrative designs, patterns of action, character types, themes, and images that are identifiable in a wide variety of works of literature, as well as myths, dreams, or even social rituals. Such recurrent items are usually held to be the result of elemental and universal patterns in the human psyche. So it's recurrent, it's there in human mind since time memorial. Okay. And two important antecedents to archetypal criticism are James Fraser's The Golden Bough, Carl Jung's concept of depth psychology. So these are the two important works related to archetypal criticism. Now, Fraser identified elemental pattern of myth and rituals to recur in the legends and ceremonials of diverse and far-flung culture and religion. Jung applied the term archetype to primordial images, that is, the psychic residue of repeated pattern of experience in our very ancient ancestors, which survive in the collective unconscious of the human race. So, Jung applied the term archetype to primordial images, which is there in the collective unconscious of the human race, or expressed in myths, religion, dream, private fantasies, as well as in work of literature. And Fraser identified the elemental pattern of myth and ritual that recur in the legends and ceremonials of diverse and far-flung cultures and religions here. But Jung consider it as a psychic residue of repeated pattern of experience in our very ancient ancestors, which survive in the collective unconscious of the human race. Now, archetypal criticism was given impetus by Morton's Archetypal Pattern in Poetry, which was published in 1934. G. Wilson Knight, Robert Graves, Philip Wheelwright, Richard Chase, Leslie Fielder, and Joseph Campbell and Northrop Frye. All these writers gave importance for archetypal criticism. Now, the death rebirth theme is treated as the archetype of the archetypes because it's there since the time immemorial, and it is based on the cycle of the season and that of human life. All these are there known as archetype of the archetypes because it exists since the birth of human beings. Now, it is in a remarkable book, Anatomy of Criticism, Northrop Frye developed the archetypal approach, and according to Frye, the totality of literary works constitute a self-contained literary universe. So Frye talks about self-contained literary universe, and that is considered as the totality of literary work, and it has been created over ages by the human imagination to assimilate the alien, and indifferent world of nature into archetypal forms that satisfy enduring human desires and needs. In this literary universe, four radical mythoi corresponding to the four seasons in the cycle of the natural world are incorporated in the four major genres of comedy, romance, tragedy, and satire. So, in this literary universe, four radical mythoi means myths, corresponding to the four seasons in the cycle of natural. So, four myths are connected to four seasons, and this is incorporated in four major genres of comedy. Now, comedy is related to spring, romance is related to summer, tragedy autumn, and satire winter. So this is how four radical mythoi corresponds to the four season. Okay, and with that we come to the end of literary criticism part 2. So with that we completed the paper, and you should understand that in this paper you come across literary critics of various periods, and here I dealt with 20th century literary criticism, and in the previous section we dealt with literary criticism of 19th century. So hope it's clear, and with that let's wind up, and thank you so much for listening.